Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan, and this is part 2 of our Labor and Business series. Last week, we heard from one of the most prominent business organizations in Washington about the realities facing employers. This week, we're spotlighting workers and labor organization perspectives. The Washington State Labor Council represents 550,000 workers from several hundred local unions around the state. It's a powerful voice in Olympia and has successfully pushed for big changes to worker benefits, job protections, and overtime and break guarantees in recent years. Joining me now with a look at some of the labor priorities for the 2025 legislative session is the president of the Washington State Labor Council, April Sims. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite.
Well, to start us off here, as we wrap up 2024, what are the major labor headlines that stand out to you? What issues really mark 2024 for labor?
I think in Washington State, 2024 was a good year for workers. We passed legislation allowing workers or making it easier for workers to form unions in their workplace, banning captive audience meetings where the employer can require workers to attend and give them information about things, anything from joining a union to conversations regarding religion and politics. We were able to ban that during the legislative session in 2024, and I think our work during the legislative session set us up really well for more victories for workers throughout the year. I mean, I think the biggest headline coming out of 2024 for workers was the successful Boeing strike, where those machinist workers were able to exercise their power and their voice and negotiate a historic contract that not only improved their wages, benefits, and working conditions, but gave them a voice with the Boeing Corporation to make sure that our aircraft is safe for any one of us who step foot on a Boeing airplane. So big year for workers in 2024.
Well, so the legislature will reconvene in January. It will be a somewhat different legislature, a lot of the same names, a lot of the same faces, but new names, new faces as well, and a new Governor-elect Bob Ferguson. So with an eye towards next year, what are some of the labor issues or priorities that stand out?
I appreciate the question. I mean, what we're thinking about right now is that working people are facing an affordability crisis. Right, the rising costs of healthcare, housing, childcare, and at the same time wages not keeping up with the rising costs of living in our state. So all of our policies are designed to drive the economy in Washington State and make sure that working families can meet their basic needs. So we are looking at things like unemployment for striking workers. We talked about this when I was here last year. We worked on this. It was a key priority for us in 2024. We're back at it again in 2025. I mean, the most recent study shows that 30% of Americans in our country have less than $400 in their savings account. And many employers weaponize that economic insecurity and force workers to make concessions at the bargaining table and use strikes as a way to leverage their power in an inappropriate way. And so allowing workers to access unemployment benefits when they do make the difficult decision to go on strike means that workers can exercise their basic voice their basic rights at the bargaining table and at the same time meet their basic needs at home.
Let's talk a little bit about the clean energy workforce and the clean energy transition. As Washington has some of the most ambitious electrification goals in the country. And then on top of that, there are emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency mining, these things. There are more demands for power, and there will be a lot more in the future. Meanwhile, we've got to get the infrastructure in place to meet those needs. And on the front line will be labor, unionized workforce.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what are some of the opportunities or maybe some of the challenges that we're looking at as we move into the new electrification era?
Yeah, well, you started the segment talking about 2024, and one of the things that I didn't mention is that we saw that Washingtonians are hungry for more infrastructure or more investments in the infrastructure around the clean energy economy, as evidenced by defeating the efforts to repeal the Climate Commitment Act. So with that in mind, workers want clean air, they want clean water, and we want good jobs that provide a glide path to the middle class. And we can do all that through the proper investments, and at the same time, make sure that we are able to meet our state's transmission needs. We're going to need more energy in order to successfully make this transmission or transition to the clean energy economy. So we are looking at siting and permitting laws and policies again this year, looking for ways to streamline that process and make it easier to build out the infrastructure we need to meet our transmission needs in the future.
On that same thread, apprenticeships, training, workforce development, those are needs that the business community has come to the table several years ago with the legislature, said we need workers. And then the legislature has been looking at pathways, creating some new pathways. And of course, the Labor Council has been involved in all of this, these discussions. So kind of where are we in terms of giving, you mentioned a launch pad or a glide path to the middle class. What opportunities are out there in Washington, and maybe what are some opportunities that you'd like to see?
Well, I mean, I think you mentioned apprenticeship, which is one of these beautiful places where industry and workers come together for a shared purpose. In Washington State, we have a proud history of having a gold standard for our registered apprenticeship programs. Most recently, our state's apprenticeship council, and I'm privileged to serve on that council, registered 2 new, really exciting, I think first in the nation apprenticeship programs. One, creating a pathway for CNAs to become LPNs through an apprenticeship program, workers in residential facilities, and the other allowing paraeducators to go through an apprenticeship program that would allow them to become special education educators in the classrooms. And I think it's through those kinds of innovations where we can look at where are the needs, the workforce development needs, and how can we build out registered apprenticeship programs that help meet those needs. The beauty of an apprenticeship program is that it starts with a job. So workers are able to get this necessary training, and they're able to work at the same time so they can still take care of their family, meet their financial needs, and the employer can invest in their workforce and build out more opportunities and pathways into the positions that we need filled the most.
When, again, going back to the legislative session that will resume January 13th, 2025, what's your perspective on the budget deficit that's being discussed? There's talk of cuts, there's talk of new sources of revenue. Meanwhile, you've got labor priorities, you've got issues you want to address. Sure. So sort of how do you see it playing out next year?
Well, we are facing a significant budget deficit, and we haven't faced a budget deficit like this since I think 2009. 2008, 2009, I think was the last time we faced a budget deficit like this. I mean, I think we learned a couple of things in 2024. Voters overwhelmingly rejected initiatives that would have cut funding to critical services like transportation and education. So I think we have to think really thoughtfully about how we're going to balance the budget, given what we've heard from voters in this last election cycle. I think we're going to have to look at ways to raise new revenue if we're going to meet the basic needs of Washingtonians in our state. I think it's a critical conversation.
Are there areas that we haven't discussed so far that are important to add as far as the discussions surrounding legislative funding for various priorities?
Legislative funding for various priorities. I mean, I think one thing that I will lift up is that the legislature needs to fully fund the collective bargaining agreements that were negotiated with public sector unions and with public sector workers. Our state, it relies on these workers to provide critical services for working families and the communities in which they live, and fully funding these collective bargaining agreements is an important part of meeting that obligation and making sure that we have the quality workforce to provide these critical services.
Briefly, if we could talk a little bit about sort of priorities and strategies surrounding artificial intelligence and protecting workers moving forward with these really potentially game-changing technologies, to use a cliche. What's your perspective on some of the emerging issues to watch?
Well, I think, AI, particularly generative AI, is unprecedented in its scale, in its impact, and right now, I think it's important that the workers who will be using those new tools have a voice in how those tools are designed, developed, and deployed in the workplace. It just makes sense for there to be a feedback loop and for workers to be able to negotiate around how those tools are deployed in the workplace. So we will be looking at legislation that expands collective bargaining to allow workers to bargain around particularly AI and generative AI. because we're in an unknown area. I think there's a lot of anxiety that the general public feels around the deployment of those tools, and having workers' voice in that process is critical.
You mentioned the unemployment for striking workers.
Mm-hmm.
That was a priority this year. That did not pass. There was some legislation that passed this year, and it will be back in 2025. Are there other benefit-related issues that are on your radar at this point for next legislative session?
Well, we will be looking at minimum wage and potentially paid vacation. You know, we think it's time that the legislature take a critical look at this. We raised the statewide minimum wage and passed paid safe and sick leave in 2016 after a nearly 20-year freeze on any sort of legislation that addressed that issue. And we think it's time to take a closer look at that again this year. As I mentioned at the top of the segment, you know, workers are facing an affordability crisis, and wages just aren't keeping up with the skyrocketing pace of inflation.
Well, we've got a little bit under a minute left, so just to give you an opportunity to bring up things we haven't talked about or to sort of summarize closing thoughts.
Oh, such a good question. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before, and you at the top of the segment, you know, we talked a little bit about 2024 was a big year for workers, and I think, you know, the labor movement remains a place of unity and a place where for workers and for families and communities that are worried about critical issues like climate justice and worker dignity and income inequality and reproductive freedom and LGBTQ rights, the labor movement is the best place to do that work, because our work, when we do it right, intersects all of those things. And this session, we are really focused on affordability, but our work expands to so many other areas.
Well, we will have to leave it there. Again, thank you very much. President of the Washington State Labor Council, April Sims, we appreciate your perspective.
Thanks for having me on.
Still ahead, a look back at the decade since labor advocates successfully passed a much higher minimum wage, and a look at what's next for working Washington. Stay with us.
I love living in Olympia. It's one of the most beautiful places to live because of Capitol Lake.
This dam has no function. You're not even allowed to let your dog swim in that lake.
In several cities in Washington, the minimum wage will be more than $20 an hour next year. It's the progression of a push that began years ago in SeaTac as a battle for a $15 minimum wage, but has since expanded to Seattle and several other locations. At the core of the fight for 15 was the labor advocacy group Working Washington, which has continued to champion various pay and benefit-related campaigns over the years. Joining me now, Danielle Alvarado, Executive Director of Working Washington. Thank you very much for your time today. To get us started here, can you take us back to the origins of sort of the Fight for 15 movement and the significance of the benchmark that will kick in next year?
Yeah, so next year we're celebrating 10 years since the Fight for 15 launched here in Washington. And just going back to what got us to that point, you know, workers in Washington, working families, were really confronted with stagnant wages, lower quality of life, and really felt like, you know, we deserve something better in Washington. And so what we've seen in the Fight for 15 is work that started in SeaTac and moved to Seattle has really not only improved quality of life in Washington, but became a flashpoint for work that has expanded across the country to make sure that workers have living wages, can support themselves, and really have dignity on the job. And we've seen, you know, that work continue even in Washington. A number of other cities since 2015 have taken up the charge to raise wages. We've seen that in Seattle. We saw it in Everett this year. King County took up a minimum wage ordinance. So it's really had a huge impact, changing the conversation and the day-to-day paychecks that people are taking home.
What's your perspective on the some of the studies that have been done about the minimum wage or the effect, and the fact that a lot of the studies since 2015 have included what happened with, for example, Seattle's minimum wage, that there is a net benefit for workers was the conclusion of some study, but that it maybe was also, there was some trade-offs. Sometimes it helped some workers more than others. Of course, the businesses frequently say, you know, this will they'll reference the wage price spiral, or as it's called. Wages go up, so then costs go up, so then which eats into the wages and just contributes to inflation. But from your perspective, based on what's happened here, has this been a success?
Absolutely. I think something you just said about costs and spending money, it's really important to note that the workers who benefit most, the lowest wage workers, which is who we represent, low wage workers who don't have the benefit of a union, that are working in industries with very low pay, oftentimes a lot of labor violations, stand to benefit the most when minimum wage goes up. And what that means is those families immediately have money that's in their pockets that they reinvest in the local economy. So when we're talking about workers, they are also customers of businesses in the communities that they live in. So that ability to immediately put money back into the local economy has made local economies and the state economy grow. And we know that when workers can spend money, that means that they're able to afford childcare, they're able to make sure they can pay their rent, pay for their medical bills, and all of that is improving quality of life for workers and also helping the businesses, that are in the communities that they live in. We have saw, concern about what will happen to businesses in Seattle in 2015. Those businesses have continued to thrive, and I think that the work that we did starting 10 years ago has really helped us. The reality is that inflation has been a huge issue in the past 2 years, impacting all of us, including workers. And it makes me think about what would workers be experiencing now if we hadn't taken those steps to make sure that their wages had increased when we did. And so I'm really think that the work not only has been a success, but really signals something about what it means to be proactively thinking about what working families need. And it's really been, like I said, a signal to the rest of the country. And you can see how successful it's been in all of the other places that have also taken it up.
So in terms of other worker policy areas that are on your radar, what are some of the issues that we might expect to see Working Washington campaign on in the near future?
Yeah, so our organization is really dedicated to making sure that every worker in our state has dignified wages and good working conditions. And so really core to our focus is thinking about the industries and workers that are often left behind. So this year, one of our main priorities is a bill that we're working on with Senator Saldana to create a Bill of Rights for domestic workers. Domestic workers as an industry are excluded from national labor laws. And so we think it's really important in the state of Washington that we make sure that the nannies and the house cleaners and the gardeners have access to the same basic workplace protections that we almost take for granted for other industries. So the right to minimum wage, to have access to sick time, to have access to workers' comp. So that's one real big priority for us because we know the care economy impacts so many families across the state, and it's really important to make sure that that work is dignified and stable. We're also looking at policies that are helping to make sure that our safety net is robust and includes everybody. We know there's bipartisan support and a lot of enthusiasm around the success of our paid family medical leave program, for example. We saw during the pandemic how essential it was that all workers have access to unemployment. So that's really on our minds too, making sure that low-wage workers really have full access to those programs, which again are not just a nice thing to do, they're really important pieces of making sure that we prevent evictions, that we keep kids in school, that we keep families housed. And so those are some really big priorities for us. The work around raising wages is something that we are seeing continue at both the local and state level. And so we'll be keeping an eye on opportunities to make sure that wages for Washington workers are really making sure that they meet the moment and really not only meet needs here, but continue to set that leadership nationwide.
Let's talk about the gig economy too, and the role of campaigns for improving pay for starters, which in Seattle I think was the origin of this campaign here, but there has since been a state law too, which is passed to provide to increase some benefits, sometime compensation requirements for transportation network companies. The pay up movement, I believe it's the easiest way to describe it, in Seattle has raised the pay for the people that work for companies like, basically the app-based food delivery companies. And so there's been some controversy surrounding that issue in Seattle, and before the council was considering, I think, a revised version of that, may still be. But from your perspective, is Washington still in the process of finding a balance on that issue, or do you think that these are growing pains or something?
Yeah, so I think something that is at the core of why we work with gig workers, and there's other organizations that also work with other parts of the economy, is that the gig economy includes rideshare, includes delivery, but at the end of the day, from our perspective, is not fundamentally different than any other kind of work that people do. So again, going back to what is our baseline for what workers deserve in our state, really drives the work that we do with the gig economy. So gig workers should have stable pay that they can predict, the ability to know when they are working, the ability to not be fired with no notice. And those issues were the kinds of things that we were hearing from workers over and over again. And as the gig economy has grown and grown and grown, we think it's been really essential to make sure that it grows in a way that's in line with Washington values. And so, we have policies at the local level. As you mentioned, there's other work that has been taken up at the state level for the rideshare, which is a different, piece of the gig economy. And ultimately, when workers are covered by basic labor standards, that is better for workers and it's better for the economy. And so from our perspective, that's what we're seeing happen with the gig economy right now, is that it is coming in line with the rest of the workforce. And that's important, and that's a good thing, especially because we know who's in the gig economy. Among other parts of the workforce, we know there are people who are chronically ill, people with disabilities, immigrant workers, workers who may not be able to access other work. And I think it says something about our values as a state that we've said those workforces are going to have the same basic rights and protections that every other workforce does.
When you're raising the wage, the basic minimum wage for a sector, sometimes a company or a sector, more than one company, will respond with automation, or they will warn of automation or replacing jobs, and ultimately, eliminating positions. What's your perspective on automation and that debate, and how do you raise standards for workers in a way that is sustainable with business, so that businesses maybe don't, invest in automation so quickly?
Yeah, so in the parts of the economy that we work in, we haven't seen a transition to automation. And I think what I would say is that companies can't grow without a workforce. And our economy can't grow without workers employed in high quality jobs. It's not in the interest of business to have a huge part of our workforce not able to access work. And it's not in the interest of workers to not be able to have that local job that then they can also work at and then invest in the local economy. And so, from our perspective, it's not an either or. It's about how does our economy grow in a way that continues to include working families, recognizing that our economy doesn't grow without workers, and also recognizes that as the economy evolves and new types of work develop, that we have learned things about how to make sure that work is high quality, stable, and accessible for all. And I really think that there's ways to work together, labor and business, to make sure that we have an economy that really reflects our values and is making sure that our families continue to thrive.
We are almost out of time, maybe 30 seconds left. Anything we didn't get to that you'd like to add, or just to wrap us up here?
Yeah, the last thing I'd like to add is just we're in a moment where the national trends really reinforce how important it is that we continue to have leadership in Washington on questions of economic equality and a growth economy and support for working families. And I think our track record really demonstrates that we have the will, the expertise, the bipartisan support to continue centering the needs of working families and growing our economy. And so we're really looking forward to opportunities to succeed in terms of advancing policies, but also making sure that Washington continues to be the national leader that it can be and has been.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much again, Danielle Alvarado, Executive Director of Working Washington. We appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
Although it will be higher in some cities, the baseline state minimum wage will rise to $16.66 per hour in 2025. For workers under the age of 16, the minimum wage will be $14.16 per hour. For comparison, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. The Impact is available online anytime in video and podcast form at tvw.org. You can always follow us on X at The Impact TVW for updates about coverage and state political news. That brings our fall 2024 season to a close. The Impact will return when the 2025 legislative session begins, including live coverage from the state capitol on January 13th, which is day one. Please join us then. Thank you for watching, and take care.